First of all, what is Galleri? Galleri is a blood test that has the potential to detect up to 50 different types of cancers from a single blood draw. These include cancers where we don't have standard recommended screening, things like pancreatic, ovarian, esophageal, liver, other types of cancers. The promise of Galleri is you can potentially detect cancer before the symptoms appear if you get a cancer detected signal. There's about a 50% chance you don't actually have cancer. It creates a lot of anxiety for people to be told you have cancer. It leads to unnecessary follow-on diagnostics and procedures, some of which can be very invasive. The trial actually failed to meet its primary endpoint, which was showing a reduction in stage 4 cancer, and the stock proceeded to tank by about 50%. Would you take the Galleri test? It costs about For me personally, the answer was yes. Hey everyone, welcome to the OptiSpan podcast. On today's episode, we're going to do a deep dive into the Galleri multi-cancer detection test. It really asks the question, is it time for us to abandon Galleri as a useful tool in the clinic? The rationale for putting this episode out is that a few weeks ago, the company that manufactures Galleri, Grail, released the results of an NHS trial in the UK where the test failed to meet its primary endpoint. We'll talk about those results. This is not a hot take. It's not a defense of the test. It's not a takedown of the test. It's really an attempt to separate what we know, what we don't know, and ask whether Galleri currently makes sense at a few different levels, at the whole population level, within at-risk populations, and then for individuals who are interested in taking the test. So first of all, what is Galleri? As it turns out, I have a Galleri test right here. Galleri is a blood test that is able to detect multiple types of cancers. It has the potential to detect up to 50 different types of cancers from a single blood draw. Importantly, these include both cancers where we have existing screening methods available, things like breast, colorectal, cervical, and lung cancer, as well as cancers where we don't have standard recommended screening, things like pancreatic, ovarian, esophageal, liver, other types of cancers. So it seems very useful from that perspective that from a single blood test, you could detect up to 50 different cancers. It works by detecting circulating tumor DNA. So this is DNA given off from the tumors that gets into the bloodstream. And specifically, it uses methylation patterns on that circulating tumor DNA to identify a cancer signal. And epigenetics is nice here because, in principle, it allows you to detect both the presence of the cancer as well as, in many cases, the tissue of origin, so predict what type of cancer it is and where it arose. It's important to say Galleri and all of the existing multi-cancer detection tests are meant to be complementary to traditional screening methods, not a replacement for traditional screening methods. So again, the core promise of Galleri and other multi-cancer early detection tests is you can potentially detect cancer before the symptoms appear. You can potentially detect more cancers than existing screening methods. You could potentially shift diagnoses to earlier stages, so stage 1, 2, where treatment options are often much more successful compared to late stage cancers. You can, in theory, if you're successful at doing that, reduce the number of late stage cancers because you'll detect them earlier and prevent them from reaching late stage. And then in principle, you could reduce mortality by detecting cancers early. So as I mentioned, Grail is the company that produces Galleri, and they released a press release on February 19th of 2026 teasing the results from this NHS Galleri trial. So the NHS Galleri trial is a very large 3-year clinical trial that included more than 140,000 people who each took 3 of these Galleri multi-cancer detection tests over a period of about 3 years. So they teased the press release, or put the press release out teasing the trial results on February 19th. The title of that press release was Landmark NHS Galleri Trial demonstrates a substantial reduction in stage 4 cancer diagnoses, increased stage 1 and 2 detection of deadly cancers, and 4-fold higher cancer detection rate. That sounds pretty darn good, right? The problem is, the take-home of the story was that the trial actually failed to meet its primary endpoint, which was showing a reduction in stage 4 cancers. So obviously they did their best to put a positive spin on the story, noting the higher detection of early stage cancers and favorable trends in late stage cancers. But the fact is they missed their endpoint and the stock proceeded to tank by about 50%. So shareholders took a big hit. A couple of news articles came out. Actually, a bunch of news articles came out right after the press release. One I read was in the New York Times, another in the BBC. I thought the New York Times article was a little overly negative. I thought the BBC article was more balanced, but both of them made the point that the trial missed its primary endpoint. And that's really what clinical trials are judged by. So that leaves us, now with this question about, what do we know about Galleri? What does this mean? How should we use it? And that's what we'll get into through the rest of this episode today. So first, a disclaimer, we use Galleri in some of our programs at OptiSpan. That's why I have the Galleri test right here. It's not for everyone. We don't recommend it for all of our clients, but we do recommend it for those whose medical history suggests that they may be at high risk for cancer. And for clients who want access to the test, we do make it available to them. OptiSpan doesn't receive any financial kickback from the company for using the test. I don't have any stock in Grail or any financial interest in Galleri. So here's my take before the trial results came out. So I was not ready to say that Galleri should be rolled out to the general population. I think there are good reasons why it's probably not there yet. And that's not necessarily because it doesn't work, but because we don't know that the benefit exceeds the risk at the population level. And there are some reasons to be concerned about Galleri when it comes to rolling this out to a large number of people. I was of the opinion it's probably suitable for certain high risk populations. And there's some trial data there to back that up, and that individuals should have the choice to take the test if they want to, as long as they understand sensitivity and specificity, and especially the risk of a false positive, which we'll talk more about. So that was before the trial. And let's start with number one, that the Galleri is not suitable for population screening yet. And again, that's not because it doesn't work. We'll talk about what it means to work, but work to detect some cancers. But again, because we didn't have data suggesting that benefit exceeds risk. And you may be asking, what's the risk? It's just a blood test, right? Not a big deal. And it's true. The test itself is not dangerous in any way, at least the process of taking the test. But the biggest risks are around false positives and false negatives. So a false positive in this case would mean you take the test, you don't have cancer, but you get a report back that says cancer detected. And that does happen. And we'll talk more about that. Why is that a problem? Well, it sure creates a lot of anxiety for people to be told you have cancer, or at least cancer has been detected. It leads to, in that case, unnecessary follow-on diagnostics and procedures, some of which can be very invasive depending on the type of cancer that was detected. And there's additional cost associated with those follow-on procedures. So there are some real risks to a false positive. There's also risk to a false negative. If you have cancer and the test says no cancer detected, that may give you false confidence. It's reasonable to speculate some people might then not go do the traditional screening methods, like say a colonoscopy, because they have this false reassurance. And again, as we'll talk about later, both of those happen with Galleri, and it's just important to know what the likelihood of a false positive and a false negative is if you're considering Galleri. Okay, so let's talk about the benefit side of the equation, because that's really what this trial was designed to assess, was whether there's enough benefit to justify a population level rollout of this test. Again, presumably to be paid by NHS in the UK and insurers in the United States if the trial was successful. So what does it mean to show sufficient benefit at the population level for a screening tool? You've got to show significant improvements in detection and significant reductions in disease progression or mortality. That's kind of the bar that's been set for population-wide screening approaches. And then, of course, there's the cost, right? So again, if we're talking about something that national healthcare systems are going to pay for or insurers are going to pay for, there is a real financial piece here where the cost of the diagnostic can't be so prohibitively expensive that even if there's a benefit, it's just impractical or not pragmatic to make available at the population level. So currently Galleri costs ballpark $1,000. It seems to have come down a little bit in price. Assume it would cost, maybe half that at scale. So that's probably not prohibitive for a population level screening approach if it was very, very effective. So let's talk about the design of the NHS Galleri trial. And again, I'm pretty confident here that the company's goal was to create a compelling case for population-wide rollout of Galleri to the general population, say everybody over age 50 or so. And again, as we just discussed, that's a pretty high bar. You've got to show that efficacy across everyone now, at least everyone above 50, is significant, and that it outweighs the unintended negatives and the economic cost, or at least the efficacy justifies the economic cost. So that's the goal. And I think that this goal caused them to pick a primary endpoint for their clinical trial that was pretty tough. But of course, if you can get buy-in to roll this out to the general public, that's a really big market. So you can understand why, from a business perspective, Grail would certainly want Galleri to become a standard screening test in the general population. Okay, so let's dive into the actual design of the NHS Galleri trial. Again, as I mentioned before, this is 140,000 plus asymptomatic adults, so they don't have cancer diagnoses or cancer symptoms, the general population between ages 50 and 77. The population was randomized. I think it was half-half. Either got usual care, so regular recommended screenings, or Galleri plus usual care, so Galleri on top of the recommended screenings. They had 3 annual blood tests where they got the Galleri test. It wasn't 100% clear, but I'm guessing it was like 0, 12, and 24 months. And then the individuals were followed for up to 3 years or 36 months. And the primary endpoint here, and again, remember, primary endpoint is what the clinical trial is judged on. It is what the clinical trial is statistically powered to detect, at least in theory, based on power calculations that are done before the clinical trial starts. So its pre-specified primary endpoint was a reduction in combined stage 3 and stage 4 cancers in the group that received Galleri compared to those who did not receive Galleri. So pretty straightforward primary endpoint. And what they're really trying to show here is what's called a stage shift, where the cancers are detected earlier, and therefore you can treat those cancers if fewer progress to these later stage cancers. One of the challenges here is that Galleri is known to be better at detecting later stage, more aggressive cancers compared to early stage cancer. So they had some things working against them from the very beginning in this trial design. I'm assuming that they, did all of their statistical models, did the power calculations, and that made them optimistic that even with some of these challenges, that the approach had a chance of working. But it apparently didn't. And they saw no statistically significant reduction in stage 3, 4 cancers overall. So that's it. That's why the trial is being called a failure. And that's a fair interpretation. They didn't hit their primary endpoint. And it seems to be the case that there were some positive things that came out of the trial. The company, at least in their press release, reported 20% reduction in stage 4 diagnoses in screening in the later rounds, a 4-fold increase in overall cancer detection rate. Some of this was in the title of that press release. An increase in stage 1 and stage 2 detection for the most aggressive cancers, or the highest mortality types of cancers. And the later rounds in the trial showed stronger stage 4 reduction. So that's this trend in the right direction, just didn't reach statistical significance. This is often the case in clinical trials. You'll miss your primary endpoint, but there's some hints that there may be efficacy, either not to the extent that you were hoping for, or different from exactly what you were hoping for, or what often happens is your assumptions around the power calculations when you designed the trial weren't quite right, so you just didn't have the statistical power you needed to detect the change, even if the change was there. So I don't think we should dismiss positive findings, even if the primary endpoint failed to be reached in clinical trials. It is important to note, however, that all of these, positive takes on the data have not been published yet. This is coming from a press release. I haven't seen the data. I don't think they're available yet. So we are sort of taking the company's word for it at this point. But it sounds promising. So we'll see what the data actually show. Again, though, the take home is that they missed their primary endpoint. And so this isn't ready for population rollout. It is possible that when all the data has been analyzed and reported, there will be enough signal there to reevaluate. But I think at this point, it would need to be pretty darn compelling to get NHS or insurers elsewhere to buy into the idea of rolling this out at the population level. Okay, so that's kind of the population level take and where we're at. And I think that's the right place to land. What about for high-risk individuals, people who have previously had cancer or people who have strong genetic risk factors or family histories of cancer? Does it make sense for them to get Galleri? And should insurers pay for that? Again, recognizing the population risk does not necessarily equal individual risk. And this is where nuance starts to matter. Public health decisions are often based on average risk across millions. Some recommendations can apply to subsets of people who are at high risk. And we do this in cancer all the time. We recommend annual low-dose CT scanning for current smokers, but not for non-smokers, because lung cancer is going to be much higher in current smokers. We recommend earlier colonoscopies for people who have a family history of colon cancer. So this kind of stratification, risk stratification, is common among other screening methods and might be appropriate for Galleri. So we don't have any data from this NHS trial to suggest one way or the other whether Galleri should be recommended for certain high-risk populations. There's no data, as far as I know, and it wasn't really talked about in the press release, supporting that or supporting that, not supporting that. Maybe we'll have more when the full results are released. But remember, the NHS Galleri trial was done in the general population, so they weren't starting with specific high-risk subgroups. It is worth noting that there is data from other clinical trials that have been done with Galleri supporting the idea that in certain high-risk groups, the test does show statistically significant benefits. So again, I think personally there's reason to be optimistic that Galleri can be useful, at least in certain high-risk groups, and clinical trials are ongoing to actually be able to put that case together and perhaps influence policy recommendations. So now what about the individual level, right? What should you and other individuals be aware of if you want access to the test? Again, even without population level endorsement, individuals have the right to choose screening tests. And that choice really should be informed by understanding the limitations of the test, your willingness to pursue follow-up testing if you get a cancer-detected signal, and your psychological tolerance for uncertainty. Both directions, right? Again, remember, false positives and false negatives are possible with any screening test. So do you understand that false positives are possible? Are you prepared for those downstream imaging or biopsies or other diagnostics? Can you tolerate the ambiguity of maybe you have cancer? Would a negative result falsely reassure you? Or would you be inclined to skip other routine screening because you got a negative Galleri test? Those are all the kinds of questions you should be thinking about before you make the decision one way or the other on a test like Galleri. Just realize screening is not neutral, and the results you get create cascading events that can influence your health outcomes. So let's just take a minute to talk about Galleri specifically and false positives and false negatives. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on sensitivity and specificity here, but these are terms that are used to describe how well a screening test works. Okay, so let's start with sensitivity. Sensitivity is really telling you how good is the test at detecting whatever it is supposed to detect. In the case of Galleri, that's going to be cancer, right? How sensitive is it at catching that signal? And when a test does what it's supposed to do, that's called a true positive. In other words, if you have cancer and you get a cancer detected positive result that was positive and it was correct, it was true. So that's true positive. You've got the condition, the test detects it. Okay. The flip side of that is you've got the condition and you get a cancer not detected result. It's a negative result, right? That's called a false negative, right? You got the negative result, no cancer detected, but that was false because you actually have cancer. So that's true positive and false negative. In sensitivity, if you hear that word sensitivity with the test, that's just if you think about all the people who have the condition, the disease, what proportion of people are flagged as having the disease? What proportion of that are true positives? So mathematically, sensitivity is true positives divided by true positives plus false negatives. Of everybody who has cancer, what percentage of people actually end up testing as a positive? And for Galleri, it's about a coin flip, right? Ballpark, 50-50. A little bit better in some conditions, but that's close. So you seem to know that going in. If you've actually got cancer and you take a Galleri test, it's about a 50% chance it's going to tell you cancer was detected. Okay, so that's sensitivity. Specificity now is kind of the other piece of the puzzle, and that can be defined as the proportion of people who do not have the disease who were correctly identified as not having the disease. Okay, so in other words, you don't have cancer now. What percentage of people are going to actually be a true negative, right? You'll get a no cancer detected result, and that'll be the right answer. Okay, that's how we define specificity. And for Galleri, it's pretty good. About 99% of people who don't have cancer will get a no cancer detected result. Only 1% of people will get a false positive result, right? Where the test came back positive, you have cancer, but you don't really have cancer. True negatives in that case are 99%, and the false positives, the people who didn't have cancer but got a cancer detected signal, are about 1%. Okay, that's 99% specificity. That's actually pretty good for screening methods. But here's the rub. If we're screening a low-risk population like everybody over 50, your likelihood from an individual level of getting a false positive is actually pretty significant. And it turns out it's about, at the individual level, if you get a cancer detected signal, it's about a coin flip as well as to whether or not you really have cancer, right? So let's just walk through that. You have a 99% specificity. You have 100 people. We're going to give the Galleri test to 100 people in the general population, right? We know the rate is about 1% in the general population. So if we, on average, about one person is actually going to have cancer, and there's about a 50% chance Galleri is going to detect that. 99 people don't have cancer, but there's about a 1% rate that Galleri is going to give a positive signal in people who don't have cancer. So out of that 100, there's a pretty good chance one person is going to get a cancer detected signal who doesn't actually have cancer, right? So out of that 100, 2 cancers were detected. Let's just say Galleri did a good job of detecting the real cancer, and there was one false positive, right, at the 1% rate. 2 cancers were detected, but only one of those people actually have cancer, right? That's where we get this 50% false positive chance at the individual level if you get a cancer detected signal. And that's about what we see. So the actual real world experience matches up with what we would expect based on these rates of true positives, of false negatives. Okay. So just to reiterate, if you have cancer, it's about a 50% chance that Galleri is going to detect it. That seems pretty good to me for a screening tool. And if you get a cancer detected signal, there's about a 50% chance you don't actually have cancer. Now, if you don't have cancer, 99% chance you're not going to get the cancer detected signal. But if you do get that, there's really only about a 50% chance that you're going to actually find cancer in all the follow-up procedures that are done. So that's sort of where we're at. And I kind of feel like, that's what you need to consider if you're considering the Galleri test. Just as an aside, I once asked the Galleri rep, would it be possible if instead of only taking the test once, like if somebody gets a cancer detected signal, if you take the test again right away, what's the likelihood you're going to get a false positive twice in a row? And she didn't know the answer. I don't know the answer. Seems likely that if you do that, maybe twice even, you can cut that way down on the false positive rate. I get it. That's probably more expensive. I don't know if they have data. It just seems like, given how much anxiety that it creates for people to have false positive cancer diagnoses, that might be something that would be worth thinking about. I don't have any data. Maybe there's a good reason why that would work. So anyway, that's kind of where we land with Galleri, and those are the kinds of things you need to think about. There's a little bit more information about Galleri. It seems as though the sensitivity varies by stage, so it's better at detecting later and more aggressive cancers. I alluded to that before. Probably not quite as good in low-risk populations as in high-risk populations, maybe for that reason. But, the idea that you're going to be more likely to capture the most aggressive types of cancers, the cancers that lead to the highest mortality, is a check mark in the positive side, I think, for Galleri. So does Galleri add any value now after we go through all this? Is it a useful test? I think the answer is yes. It sort of seems obvious that a relatively non-invasive test that detects about half of existing cancers with a false positive rate of 1%, which is, by the way, better than any other cancer screening method we have, at least in terms of false positive rate, should have some clinical value. We just have to figure out how best to use it. And at this point, I don't think population rollout is justified. For high-risk individuals, I think it becomes a case-by-case discussion, right, between the physician and the client. But I personally think there's probably value in certain high-risk populations to the Galleri test right now, even though we may not have the definitive clinical trial data to prove that. And then for individuals, lower risk individuals, I think it really becomes a personal choice. Of course, there's the economic piece. Like I said, the test costs about $1,000. Not everybody can afford a $1,000 test. That sucks. That's just the reality. But for those who can and who are interested, then I think you just need to think through everything that we talked about today and your sort of, psychological ability, resilience in the situation that you do get a false positive, that you get a cancer detected. What impact is that going to have on you, your anxiety, all of that stuff. So that's sort of where I land at the individual level. As I said, we do offer Galleri in some of our programs. We don't recommend it for everyone, and it becomes a sort of individual conversation with your physician, being fully informed about what the test can do, what its false positive and false negative rates are. So that's kind of where I land. I'm interested to know where you land. So please share your answers below. For me personally, the answer was yes. I took a Galleri test very early on when we were considering adding this to our Helix program at OptiSpan, both because I wanted to know for myself and also because I feel an obligation to try really anything that we use as part of our core toolkit before we roll it out to clients. So what's your take? Would you take the Galleri test if it costs $5? Would you take the Galleri test given that it costs about $1,000, and why? Please leave your comments below and we'll look forward to reading them. As always, if you have any questions, also leave those below. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the podcast.